Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today all the way from Central Standard Time is Mr. Drew Levanti. Drew, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mychal. I'm really excited.
Drew, I definitely am excited to dive into the conversation that we're going to be having today. But before we get there, for those of you who this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is the podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also actively impacting this greater field of astrology that we know and love. So if you want to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, go down below and like this video from now, because I can assure you that it's going to be an amazing interview. But also subscribe to the Oraculos True Divination podcast and also hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when I bring you these interviews each and every week. Now, Drew, once again, I am super stoked to have you here with me on the show because we have history tangentially, because we both spoke at the Queer Astrologers conference not that long ago, earlier in the summer. So I'm super excited to be able to connect with you again.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, we were also on Fresh Voices together
as well.
So yeah, we've got that parallel track here, and I don't think we've messaged a little bit, but yeah, getting some FaceTime here is really cool.
Most definitely, Drew. And I remember, I think it was probably a few weeks ago, I dare say a month ago now, I got a chance to pop in to your horoscopes that you were doing for people over on Instagram. And I thought that was pretty cool. And I really enjoyed feeling your depth. And it wasn't the pop astrology that I think so many people are used to, but you really were letting people know, hey, this is what's up, and this is what these configurations mean. And you really gave it a beautiful traditional flair. And so I knew that I wanted to get you on the show.
Yeah, those horoscopes were really fun. I appreciate your feedback on that. It's interesting coming into astrology where my teachers are definitely traditional astrologers, like Chris Brennan and Austin Coppock have been the two people who I've formally studied with. And so obviously there's a lot of traditional lineage there for me. But, I started out on astrology just watching YouTube videos. And so there is this kind of blend that comes in, and it's this interesting combination of, meditating on my own astrology and whether to fit it into traditional or modern or anything like that. I think that this next generation of astrologers who's coming in, and I am Pluto in Sagittarius, so I consider myself in that group. A lot of people are using traditional frameworks and techniques now, but I think when people say traditional, a lot of times what they're talking about is more of a cultural or some sort of approach to knowledge, like an epistemological framework for astrology, which I find a little weird because it's a lot of times traditional becomes this way of dismissing other forms that are, I don't want to make value judgments about any of it because I feel myself a part of both of these. And so I'm really interested to see where we head with astrology. And that's what I try to bring into the horoscopes and any kind of astrology I do is really just this presence with the chart and seeing what emerges from that space organically. Because I think, there's so many dimensions of just one chart that can come out. And when you're in conversation with somebody, it's really magical. And so leaving the labels behind can be useful to just let what will come.
I think it's really important, this point that you're making in terms of assessing this astrology that we practice from this broader perspective of just looking at it as astrology, because we know that lineage is definitely important, and lineage is really important when it comes to studying traditional astrology, because if you are an astrologer who's studying with Austin Coppock, I know something about the sort of astrology that you practice. If you're an astrologer studying with Chris Brennan, I know something about this sort of astrology you practice. Same with John Frawley, Lee Lehman, myself. If you study with me, you know what sort of astrology you're getting. So I think it's really important that we identify that, yes, there is this lineal relationship that we have to our astrology that connects us to the tradition in a much bigger way, but then also acknowledging that we're in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, evolution is still a part of who we are. And we still have to take advantage of some of the opportunities that we've been given astrologically in the 21st century. Yes, with traditional astrology, but also with the astrology of tomorrow. So I love the fact that you're creating this fusion within your work, because it's really important for more people to have a solid traditional training that allows them to interact with the astrology of today.
Yes, totally agree. I find it a very necessary foundation, just because when you have that foundation, you have those building blocks, that enables so much creativity within your thinking, and you can really make something new with the concepts. Because, when astrologers give you delineations about things, they're about a certain placement. Typically, like if they're really like deep in their practice, this is stuff that they've come up with on their own. But that doesn't come from nowhere. It's not like you're just like, sometimes maybe it comes out of the blue and some kind of Uranian experience and you just get struck by a bolt of lightning. But I think more often it's a careful play with the symbols and the building blocks of knowledge that you have from your basics. And then all of these new things can come out of it.
Definitely true. Now, Drew, before we go too deeply down the rabbit hole of this conversation, talk to us a bit about who you are and how it is you got attracted to astrology, and really, where has your astrology taken you since then?
Yeah, so I currently live in Chicago. Who am I? I am from the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. I have always been about my education. And so I live in Chicago now. I went to college here. I studied anthropology. I studied specifically environmental anthropology in terms of climate change and the way that climate change is impacting social life. And with that, I've been interested in temporality and time and how actions taken in one point change life in another, and these sorts of ways of thinking across time and engaging with time as a non-linear form. But before that, like, how did I even get there? I mean, astrology kind of comes out of this interest in time more generally. And when I was growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I'll just abbreviate that whole story as saying that it was a very new age situation that I was raised in. And so I was raised with like popular quantum physics and thinking around manifestation. The movie What the Bleep Do We Know was created in like when I was 8 years old, I believe. And that was a really big deal in my life because the people who made that movie were a part of the same like spiritual group that I was. It was a couple thousand people, like retreats, this kind of situation. One of the things that I really struggled with when I was young is prediction, and the way that the predictions of this world were very restricting for me. So I often heard about the days to come. It was this kind of apocalyptic imaginary of the future that was impossible to ignore because it just made it so that I couldn't even go to the closest city to me because there was going to be an earthquake or there was going to be some kind of disaster that would end my life. And I do have Saturn down there in the fourth house. So prediction is so important in life, in all respects. And what I have learned over time is that prediction is really a way of life, and there's no getting out of it. Even people who think of themselves as rationalists or, materialists, what have you, prediction is infused into every aspect of the way that we live our lives because it's how we make decisions. We can't, for example, like me not being able to travel because the world might end, like that was an action that had practical implications for what I was and was not able to do, or what was and was not safe. Similarly, you know, the Wall Street banker who has all of their money in some fund somewhere, they're not going to go on vacation if they think the market's going to crash, or they're going to pull out their money. And so there's all these different ways that prediction is important for the way that people live their lives. And so astrology is, you know, coming from this traditional lineage where prediction is really the focus, and there's even an approach to fate in many conceptions of this framework. That prediction in astrology, I think, is a way of slowing down that predictive mentality and being really reflective, almost like philosophy, natural philosophy, thinking about how prediction is leading me, seeing the symbols that are creating this prediction for me and really breaking it down and having a spiritual experience with the symbols in terms of guiding my actions, instead of reading the forecast in the news, or the economic or the political forecast. I think there's a much more rooted approach to life and prediction in life that is accessible to me through astrology. At least that's what I want to share with people.
Drew, I think it's really great that prediction in astrology is something that you haven't ran away from, because in the 21st century, the concept of prediction and the concept of there being a concrete astrology that actually does frame itself in a way that allows it to make predictions is something that's been poo-pooed on by a lot of modern astrology. But as you and I both know, prediction is the heart, essentially, of traditional astrology. And I think it's really lovely and refreshing to hear a young person speak in this way, because we need more people who are at least willing to interact with astrology in this way. Because as we also know, a lot of our astrology is really experimental. We have to be the scientists within our own astrological laboratories, and by virtue of our discoveries, we create the next generation of books, or we create the next generation of standards based on our own trial and error. And so kudos to you for picking up that task of wanting to explore astrology through a predictive lens.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's so important. And, it's interesting that the predictive element has some implications along the traditional modern divide, but I find that people in both camps are typically on board with prediction, at least in terms of clients. Like, most people who come to see an astrologer think that the astrologer has access to the future in some capacity. And so it's important as astrologers to at least recognize that, even if you're not an astrologer who engages with prediction explicitly, to see that there is a need to address this uncertainty and this sometimes fear that comes with people who come to see an astrologer have these questions. And astrology really is about having questions. No matter what branch of astrology we're practicing, there is this desire to know and to have a concrete vision of the future. And as astrologers, it's really a question of how concrete do you want to make that vision? How much flexibility are you enabling in that field of possibilities? Because that's what people are going to make their life decisions based off. It's pretty wacky.
Drew, this question orientation of astrology is something that I've spoken a lot about in my own work, because I too am of the perception and the observation that astrology is question-based. We come to astrology with certain questions within our heart or our mind, whether we express them consciously or subconsciously. And for me, I have framed this in the past as being a horary approach, which is very different from calling it horary astrology, because I think that horary astrology is wonderful and beautiful, but it's its own thing. But there's an approach to astrology separate and apart from the specific branch of astrology that we call horary astrology, that I think is the horary approach. And the horary approach is acknowledging that even if I pick up a person's natal chart and I read it without having a question from that person, my ability to read that chart is completely predicated on me asking specific questions within myself. First of all, it's who am I? Or rather, who is this person? And there's a way to go into the chart and find that answer. Then, as we go through the houses, the next question that we ask of this person's natal promise is, well, what is this person's natal promise in relation to finances? And what is their natal promise in relation to siblings? And we go through the chart with these questions, whether we state them or whether that's just how our mind is working. That is how we systematically approach a chart reading. So I love that within your own practice, you've seen this necessity for the question as being a guiding force within the reading, because essentially that's all we're doing. We're asking questions whether they've been stated or not.
Yes, and that thinking that you've put forward in your work has been very inspiring for me. And I've actually signed up to practice horary. I'm doing STA later next year, so I'm really excited to have that, that the branch at least covered in my education. But it doesn't even require that necessarily. It really is just this more orientation that you're talking about. And we have questions, and then what about answers? And it's interesting because I feel that, at least in how I've practiced so far, a lot of times astrology gives you the shape of the answer, but not necessarily the answer itself. And that to me is something that's really special and interesting in terms of like what knowledge do we actually have access to, and how do you talk about the shape of something to somebody, like in a consultation setting? How do you share that shape that you have the symbolic knowledge of, that maybe they don't have that same symbolic framework? Communicating that is really interesting. And I think something that I struggle with at times and am working through continually is this leap to the end. Like, I have the shape, and sometimes I'm tempted to distill that shape into something that is a sound bite or something. It's quick, it's digestible, because a lot of times that's what people want. But is that what I should actually give? And so I'm curious to know what that makes you think of, or any thoughts that you have on that shape versus like the concrete answer.
Well, I think that what we all have to acknowledge is that we practice astrology, which is essentially a symbolic interface between us and the cosmos. And symbology and symbolism exists on a spectrum. And the only thing that makes an astrologer better at interacting with a symbolic spectrum is time and experience, and in my opinion, giving a shit ton of readings. I think that is really the place where you grow your bones in astrology. And we all start astrology with these same questions. How concrete should I go? Is it okay for me to say something with great specificity, or how symbolic should I give this thing that I'm seeing, versus can I actually say this as a concrete fact? But I think the only thing that gives the astrologer the confidence to speak with that level of concrete, I don't know, certainty feels like the wrong word, because at the same time, there's a humility that we all have to have, no matter how long you've been doing astrology or how long you've been giving readings. You still have to be humble, even though you're proficient in knowledge, because we are speaking about the cosmos around us that has within itself still the possibility of surprising even the most seasoned of astrologers. So essentially, in answering your question, Drew, there's this piece of knowing that the more I give charts, the more mistakes I make. And the more mistakes I make, the more I'll give more readings. And the more readings I give, the less mistakes I'll make, because I would have learned from the mistakes that I would have made before. And so this goes back to this scientific interaction with our astrology. Are we willing to, yes, study with great teachers who have the ability to impart great knowledge to us, but do we also have the boldness and the courage within ourselves to charge forward with our astrological practice, knowing that we will make mistakes, but also knowing that those mistakes are the most vital lessons because they teach us how to become better astrologers?
Yeah, I totally agree. And, especially that makes me think of just like little experiments with magic too, where, you get burnt and that sticks with you. Mistakes are, I agree, like really the biggest teachers when you're practicing astrology.
Most definitely. Now, Drew, we've been speaking about questions, and I know that within the work that you do, a very important question that you answer for your own clients is the question of when.
When?
So, so Drew, talk to us a bit about your relationship to electional astrology, your relationship to this question of when, and why you think that that's so important within our current astrological framework today.
Oh, it's at the this is at the core of like my entire interest. So I'll see how much I can get out there. Electional. It is this question of when. It's when am I doing something to make my desired outcome happen? And so there's kind of two ways that I look at this. And one is my personal practice with electional, where I'm electing for myself and I'm being scientific, like you're saying, seeing what happens, what works, and all of the dimensions that come into my experience in this, looking at a chart and predicting and seeing what happens. And then there's the client aspect of it, which is a little bit different because obviously I'm okay with making mistakes for myself. And I know, so with this personal practice, which I want to bring this personal approach into the client work. It's a little complicated though, and I'll explain why, is because electional is about desire. It's about what we want to happen. And when we're dealing with desire, sometimes it seems simple, or from the outset, it seems simple, like, oh, I want this, I want that. But it's really not that simple. Like, our desires are really complicated. We might want something because there's something else going on in the background. There's some subconscious stuff. There's some maybe even self-defeating tendencies. And that gets really complicated when you start talking about electional and looking at an electional chart, casting a chart for a moment. But the beautiful thing about having that chart is that chart doesn't lie. Those complexities of desire are there. And so in my personal practice with electional, practicing electional is really about weighing different charts against each other and maybe I have 5 charts that I could use for something that's really important. And you want to go through and decide which one. There's one question, which one is the best, which I don't really like that question, because I think they're all useful in the sense that every one of them is giving me the tools, the tools for contemplation. Each one of them is a contemplative practice that is getting me more in tune with what I actually want and getting below the surface of this, I want my business to go well, or I want this stuff. It's like there are going to be pitfalls in any chart, and seeing those pitfalls, or those applications to a malefic, or those planets in the 12th house, or the ruler of the 12th house in some place, all of those things are really important for my own reflection on the action. And so for me, this thing with electional in my own life is really about contemplation and getting a more complex view of what I'm doing, and being able to reflect on my actions and consult with, this is something from Jeffrey Cornelius's work that I find so powerful, is that whether you're doing whatever kind of astrology you're doing, you are consulting with the gods. You are getting you're getting a view of non-individualistic agency. You're seeing these other agencies that are a part of your own life that are shaping and constraining what's possible. And I think that's really beautiful, because if we're just thinking about, you know, the problems with different parts of culture at the moment, and if we want to think about capitalism or the inheritance of the Enlightenment and mind-body dualism and all this stuff, there's a lot of times it comes down to this overemphasis on self. And what I love about electional specifically is that it is about the self, certainly. I mean, provided that I'm electing an action that I am taking, but there are all these other parts of the chart that are speaking and that have significance. And I can see a malefic in the 7th, or I can see a malefic in the 11th. Like, how is this action going to affect my relationship with friends? And so it opens up this more holistic view of my action and the outcomes of my action. So that's the personal. And then you have the client part of it, which is really interesting. And, you know, I've been giving electional consults for a few months, and it's been a really interesting journey. I've even tinkered with like, what's the right format for it. And what I'm doing right now is doing timing, you know, like a sort of year ahead-ish style of reading, where looking at the next several months and helping people decide, like, if they don't know. A lot of people come into an electional consult and they're like, well, I mean, I could do it anytime in the next year. And I kind of like go like this, because there's so many charts within that. But, you know, you want to narrow it down to what is their chart, what is their natal chart saying is the time that something is going to take place. And then that helps constrain the view of possible elections a little bit. But desire, right? Desire in the client. How to help the client reflect on this thing that they want to do. A lot of times it's super simple. Like, I want to buy a car. You know, there are these like really mundane things that you can use electional for. And those are a little bit more simple. But then there are other times that, you know, somebody wants to like publish a book about their crazy experience in like a psychedelic journeying or something like this. And there's so much backstory. And so it's really important for me as the electional astrologer to understand that backstory, at least some. Like, obviously I can't experience it, but to at least talk to this person and hear the shape of this story and the shape of the emotionality behind it, to be able to pick a chart that is not only auspicious and, you know, promises good things for the person, but also fits the experience. So there's this question of fit versus promise, and balancing those two is really important.
Drew, I think it's really important, this concept of holism within our astrology, and this concept of having a holistic outlook on astrology, because very often, and I was saying to a group of friends yesterday that I haven't heard of many people specifically practicing electional astrology as a standalone practice that they specialize in within the 21st century. I mean, outside of some people who I know who do medical elections or surgery dates and that sort of thing within the context of medical astrology. But in terms of me saying, I'm going to send this person to an electional astrologer, that hasn't been a thing recently within my life, until hearing you at Fresh Voices and the Queer Astrology Conference, and I think also Zamboni as well. But usually the approach that people have to electing things is really comparable to sun sign astrology. It's like, I'm going to wait until Jupiter is on my midheaven, or I'm going to wait until Venus is on my ascendant. And it's something, but it's not the whole thing. And this framework that you're working from about looking at the chart in its entirety and essentially choosing a chart that's going to, and I said this yesterday in on the Black Astrologers Roundtable. I said choosing a chart, or I used the term creating a chart, and Zamboni corrected me and he said waiting for a chart. So this concept of waiting for a chart that best articulates the sort of desired outcome that we would want in all of its nuances, not just what's on my ascendant, but yes, how is that malefic going to be influencing my 11th house if it's placed there? How is it going to be influencing my relationships with my friends? Or if the rule of the 12th house is in my 7th house on this election, how will me wanting this business to start at this date influence my marriage? I think that's a really well thought out approach to electional astrology. And I'm so happy to see that being taken up now by this generation, because I've seen astrologers from the generation before not using it as skillfully as you're describing it now. So once again, congratulations to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think there's, I mean, I haven't like read every electional text in the tradition ever, but this concept of rooting to the nativity is super important. And I mean, part of that is sort of this, you know, Jupiter is transiting my midheaven, so I'm going to do an election around then. But I think rooting to the nativity, so just background on this, like the Hellenistic texts on electional actually don't even bring up rooting to the nativity. It's something that we get in the Persian and the Arabic sources, and then goes from there. Rooting to the nativity is, for me, this way to get into contemplation. It's this way to have this sacred conversation around desire, because it points to specific parts of my chart or parts of the client's chart that are, you know, they're asking for this conversation. Like my Mars place, or I've worked with people on their Mars placements. I've had 2 clients with Mars in Aries, or Mars natally in Libra recently, and they both came to me during Mars in Aries, this transit that we're having right now. And it was just so interesting because they were having to put themselves out there in this more Mars and Aries way, and they were having to compete for things and be willing to fail, and these kinds of Mars and Aries themes. And yeah, it's the natal chart is always getting a transit, and then it's this question of, you know, which transits am I choosing, which transits am I waiting for, which transits don't look auspicious, but I still want to work with them. And so I love that about electional. It's this invitation to engage with a specific energy that might not be like, you know, might not look at it in your textbook definitions of essential dignity and all this stuff and see that, you know, I don't want this thing to live forever, but maybe I can do something at this time. And there's a way to engage with that energy going forward that's actually going to enrich your life and your knowledge too, because these, in terms of being scientific, like you're always going to be getting some kind of feedback. And that's what I really love about astrology in general. And just in terms of my electional within my framework for astrology, first of all, electional, you're always paying attention to transits. Like I have sort of ephemeris brain for the next 3 months. I know like what all the dates are and all this, but there's another part of it when you get down to like day-to-day life, where it really does bring the sacred into the everyday. And there's this beautiful thing that can happen when I forget what the ascendant is at the moment, or I forget like maybe exactly what degree the moon's at. Ephemeris brain goes away for a moment, and I'm working on something, or I'm getting ready to submit something, and there's this gears clicking into place that happens. And then I'll look at the chart, I'll be like, this is the moment. So there's this way in which moments find you, and that is, is it electional? Maybe. Is it just astrology? No, I think it is just astrology. It's this bigger thing where when we practice astrology, we are being scientific about the flow of time and being in this flow. I don't even know what to say about it. It's just, it is this experience of magic that is, you know, you don't have the robes and the pointy hats, but it is magical. And you feel that in the moment when you start to engage with transits consciously, and when you start to use electional in daily life. And I would really love to start practicing with people on that. Like I do a little bit of tutoring for electional as well. And this is something that I'm trying to bring in, is this consciousness around time and this trance that can emerge from the practice. And feeling that trance is just so instructive for spirituality in general.
As I think you know, I have a perspective of astrology where all branches of astrology are a part of one unified whole.
I love it. I'm so on board.
And and I've described this several times as being astrology the hologram. And with a hologram, no matter which way you cut it or flip it or splice it, you can chop off the smallest, minutest portion of that hologram, and it will still contain the entirety of the greater figure. And for me, all branches of astrology are essentially the same. So if we say all branches of astrology are essentially fundamentally horary based, that's the truth. But if we also say all branches of astrology are about the birthing of things, and therefore all branches of astrology are natally based, that's also the truth. And if we say that,
or they're all inceptional, right?
Precisely. So if we say that all branches of astrology are based on times and the electing of a time, whether I consciously elect that time or whether the cosmos elects that time for me, then that's also true, because all branches of astrology are electional based. So I think that it's really important for the astrologer of today to find the common thread, which is something that I haven't seen so much of in the 21st century. And I think a part of that is that, you know, people have to make money essentially. So yes, let me sell this course that I'm teaching as horary, and let me give you a diploma in horary, and let me give you a diploma in mundane. But fundamentally, what I think we should be teaching towards is this common thread that runs throughout all astrology. And how can we gear the students of tomorrow to see this commonality? Because my particular rootedness in traditional astrology is specifically the Renaissance period, and how the Renaissance served as a melting pot for particularly the Arabic contribution to astrology. So it is medieval, Renaissance, and the fusion of those two things. But what we find in the Renaissance period, in the electional works of people like William Ramsay, is this concept of this astrology, the spectrum, astrology, the continuum. And yeah, maybe this Mars isn't the most dignified that I have to work with right now, but is the Mars in my natal chart the most dignified? Because if this Mars in Libra is the same as my Mars in Libra within my natal chart, then that holds a resonance that I'm familiar with. And therefore, I can do something with that because I'm familiar with that energy. And probably me, as the Mars and Libra person, I'd find it difficult to integrate within myself an election that's built around Mars and Aries, because that's a different sort of thing that isn't really a part of my normal natal hoo-ha. And so let me work with the cosmos as the cosmos is at this moment, because maybe I can find within this moment something that resonates with the heart of who I am. So all things considered, you know, whether you're doing electional that's rooted in the natal, which is pretty much something that I subscribe to, or if you're doing electional from the perspective of, well, you know, it may not be rooted in me, but it's still having some relevance, and it's still the planets, and I can still do something with them. Let me just try. You know, I think that it's important that we have this broad vision of astrology and that we know how to yield fruit from that, no matter what our particular astrological persuasion may be.
Yeah. Bringing in that broader frame for astrology as what was it that you said, the particular language of like astrology, a holistic astrology, or an astrology of that it's an approach to life. There's a philosopher named Pierre Hadot who has this book called Philosophy as a Way of Life. And I think of astrology that way, and I kind of substitute like astrology as a way of life. It's and that for me with electional, it is that flow of time that is continuous, and that my life is continuous within that, and there's an alignment that happens. And so I talk about alignment, like bringing aligned timing into the birth chart, using the birth chart as a map for the present moment, and not just the entire life, but no, like, let's look at right now. Like, what is right now? Because, I mean, Kira Taborn talks about this, like timing is everything. And I could not agree more. So yeah, I feel really inspired to see more people taking up electional or taking up these other branches, these non-natal branches, essentially, because maybe one distinction that is important culturally, because of this cultural moment that we're in with astrology, is the distinction between natal astrology and everything else. Because natal astrology has so much more popularity, and our culture is so much more interested in like, who am I? Like, tell me about me. The me generation, sort of like the aftermath of Uranus and Aries, in my opinion. And yeah, I'm so excited to see these non-natal branches coming into natal and introducing people, clients and students, to non-natal or quasi-natal approaches to astrology, because there's so much life, like, and I mean, this gets into a whole other topic of like astrology as culturally transformative, and astrology as a site for resistance against cultural norms and cultural tendencies that are problematic in some sense, or that simply that we want to change. And I think that the more that we integrate these non-natal approaches into natal and to form something that's more holistic, I think the more opportunity there is for breaking away from some of the cultural conventions that are up for revision, if that makes sense.
It does. And something that I teach my students, because of my own persuasion and placement in the world today as a gay Black male astrologer, is that astrology has, for a lot of people, for many generations, been an emancipatory discipline. And that is something that I think we really need to cherish within our astrological tradition, that astrology has been a means of people finding liberation from social, conventional, patriarchal norms. Astrology has been a direct contact point with the gods, and it has emancipated people for hundreds of thousands of years to feel as if there is a placement of Godhead within themselves, or of divinity within themselves, that allows them to interact with the numinous within their daily affairs. So yeah, the person is coming to want to know when's the best time for me to put my car up for sale, or when's the best time for me to buy a car. But that act is no less an act of magic than someone coming in and wanting to know, what is my purpose in life? And the fact that our astrology is flexible enough to hold within itself all of these broad contact points, whether we consider them the muggle perspective, oh, you muggle over there asking about, is this person who just brushed your thigh your soulmate, versus the person who's asking, You know, should I go on this spiritual retreat? Is this person my new guru? It's all magic, and we as astrologers of today need to realize that yes, we are living a magical reality, like the book you mentioned. You know, philosophy as a way of life, astrology as a way of life is fundamentally living in a magical universe full of magical connections. And things like electional astrology allows us to harmonize ourselves more with the ebbs and the flows of these titanic forces of nature and work with them in order to create an auspicious outcome for whatever it is we desire. And the last thing I'll say on this, because I know that you mentioned the word desire very strongly earlier, is that astrology as an emancipatory discipline also gives us the freedom to know that these desires that we have are valid.
Mm.
And I think that that's a very important thing, because we've been taught for so long that our desires are dirty and we shouldn't desire things of the flesh, and any desires that we have that are rooted within materiality are somehow less than. But astrology says, no, you know, all of these different things that your chart represents are things that contribute to you living a holistic and a fully fleshed out life. So if you want some second house money, then here is some second house money, because that is as valid as your ninth house philosophy. And I love that our astrology allows us to validate the desires that we have, and to know that it is okay to ask when I should sell my car, because that too is a part of a greater spiritual landscape of me living magically within the world.
Yes, I completely agree. Yeah, the re-enchantment of the everyday is very important. And, you know, I don't think the everyday was necessarily ever disenchanted. I guess that's a narrative that I have a little bit of resistance to, because, I mean, commodity culture is infused with magic. Like, why do you buy something? Because it's going to have it's going to make you beautiful. It's going to give you all of your wildest dreams are going to come true if you buy this bar of soap, right? Like, like these magical logics have been part of culture for time immemorial, perhaps even more strongly, or I don't want to, maybe not more strongly, but certainly as strongly in the context of capitalism. And since the 19th century, when, you know, this disenchantment narrative sort of, we hear this disenchantment narrative from cultural critics saying that, you know, with capitalism, we're thinking about, like, you know, your daily life. There's no room for magic because it's all according to the clock of labor, and you can only do things at certain times, so you don't have the flexibility. But I think commodity culture is something really interesting to reflect on in terms of just how magical it is. And so we're really not disconnected from these magical ways of living. We just might be calling them something different. And I think having that reflection is really powerful in terms of this question of desire, because it's not like I have to reinvent my approach to desire. Like you're saying, it's like, yeah, my current desires are entirely congruent with my chart, with my vision of the future, with my past. It's not like I'm going carte blanche and I'm like, all of a sudden I'm spiritual. Ta-da! We've always been spiritual. We've always been this sacred being. It's just a matter of recognizing it, and how sometimes scary that is. Because what are the implications of that? Like, I have always been manifesting my reality. I have always been creating and emerging as spirit. I am the embodiment of spirit. Whoa. And electional is this kind of this cool way to engage with that phenomenon and to engage with the everyday as a zone of the sacred. And so, yeah, I'm so inspired to see more people doing this, and to see where it goes, see where it takes us with philosophy, see where it takes us with emancipation as well. Like you're saying, I'm curious, I mean, we haven't talked about mundane so much because that is like this kind of this other thing in a way, like even if we have this holistic astrology, like when we start talking about groups of people and society and cities, nations, and all the things that we talk about through mundane astrology, that does seem, I mean, it's certainly at a different scale, a different register that is more difficult to talk about because it's not like you can talk about it from, well, people certainly can talk about it from personal experience. And I'm really inspired to hopefully start seeing mundane analyses engaging with discussions of privilege and social these titanic social forces. And, you know, what does it mean to really talk about the planets in the context of liberation at a mundane scale? That will be really interesting to see younger astrologers and older astrologers as well have a conversation about.
Well, it's happening.
Yeah.
And it's currently loading. It's still buffering. I can tell you that much. It's still buffering, but there's a conversation that's going to be released very soon around that. And for much of the same reason, because we have this resurgent interest in other branches of astrological lore. So we have the new surge of people who are rushing in the direction of horror reastrology, which is wonderful because we need more of that to be integrated into our larger astrological body. We have people rushing into medical astrology, which is wonderful because we need more medical astrologers. We have people who are starting to talk about a lot because of the work that you're doing, and other people who are really out here putting electional astrology on blast. We have people talking more about electional astrology and the necessity of timing. And the reason why, as far as I'm concerned, mundane astrology hasn't had that same resurgent interest is because no astrologer has ever really been paid by an individual to know about what's going on in my country this year. And insofar as the majority of us, for our years of practice, we don't really get paid by individuals or even corporations to talk about what's going on in the country this year, it hasn't been the most lucrative field. And so mundane astrology has always, I think, kind of been another thing that people do, or something that people ultimately move into as a pendant of a larger client-based practice, but not specifically because that is where they make their bread and butter. But you're right, I do completely believe that people should be paying more attention to mundane astrology. And like I said, we have some things in the works just to make that conversation be more widespread, because it's such a rich part of our tradition. And I think especially in 2020, so many of us have been sensitized to the need for placing our individual lives within the greater context of what's going on socially. And because this year has been such a champion for that, I think more and more people do realize that they need to be paying more attention to mundane astrology and mundane cycles.
Yeah, I mean, the gravitas of 2020, we don't know what's going to happen with it yet. I mean, Saturn Pluto is such a slow kind of unfolding energy that we're really going to see what the implications of this year have been. One thing that comes to mind, just, I mean, if we're getting into mundane a little bit here, the Saturn Pluto conjunction being within range of a conjunction with the earlier Uranus Neptune conjunction. That's interesting in terms of like social change and I mean, Chris Brennan wrote about the Uranus-Neptune cycle in terms of like astrological revivals. And it was like the Project Hindsight conjunction in the early 90s there. And so I'm curious what the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is bringing about in astrology. And I think that mundane is visible in that sense because the Saturn-Pluto conjunction has given, I think, anybody with any kind of like astrological study under their belt, it's loud, right? Like nobody alive has ever seen anything like 2020. And the direct match of the symbolism with so much of what's been going on, I think is going to tune people in, and it's already tuning people into the applications of this stuff. And I think it really is about, you know, diversifying the interpretive potentials with planets. I mean, we can talk about Saturn and we can talk about imprisonment, but what if, or quarantine, we can see it playing out, but what are the other manifestations of Saturn, or the other interpretations of Saturn in terms of imprisonment in society, and you know, people who have a really bad go because of social structures. And so I want to see, at this point, I'm not the person doing this, but I'd love to be in conversation with people and listen to people who have perspectives on what these, like, not only what are these planets saying about social life, but also from a predictive standpoint, once we have that vision of what the planets are and what the planets do at the scale of society, what are the stakes of prediction then? If I see something really troubling coming up at the scale of society as an astrologer, or I see something coming up like some kind of Saturnian thing, and I'm really concerned, or, you know, there's a Venus retrograde, and that's been correlated to racial justice, for example. I'm curious, like, what's going to be the approach there with predicting social events, because I just don't know. I don't know, like, is there a preparatory outcome of that? Like, okay, we're going to buckle down and prepare, but then what does preparation look like in terms of these social issues? It's very interesting, and there's so much to be done.
Most definitely there is, Drew. Now, Drew, tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about the sort of consultative work that you do and how they can get in contact with you for a reading, for a consultation, or just to connect.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that is super accessible that you can do is contact me for a mini like meetup, like we can meet face to face to just talk about possibly doing some kind of tutoring or mentorship, or if you want to engage with me in any kind of intellectual capacity, whether that's learning the technique of astrology that I use, or learning the sort of like philosophical approach and sort of riffing together on that, if that's more your speed. If you want to do anything like that, I am offering tutoring and mentorship sessions over, you know, an extended period of time. So that's something that you can consult with me for free to just chat and see what that would be like. That's on my website, which I'm sure will be, you know, in the notes and everything. And then other than that, yeah, sessions like astrology sessions for natal sessions, I do those. So if you want to read your birth chart, I'll do that. And it's, you know, it's a conversation. I think most people who've had readings, I'm not gonna like read your life as a Hellenistic, like this will be your fate now to the end of time. You'll never be anything. And then, yeah, electional consults are really fun. So if you have something coming up that you want to have supportive timing for, I do electional consults where you can elect one thing, or you can do 3 elections if there's different phases, or you can do even up to 6 elections. And those are really fun because people will, you know, when you have more elections, you really get into the flow, and it gets you in that rhythm of timing, which I think is really cool. And with those elections, I will also be reading your transits and your progressions and all of those other timing techniques that are so important for syncing up with the cosmos.
Awesome sauce, Drew. And where can we find you online as well as on social media?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter and Instagram. It's probably just easiest if you Google or you search my name. But my handle is Anthrosophist, ANTHROSOPHIST. And on the internet, I'm at rkastrology.com. That's where you can book sessions with me and all that fun stuff.
Awesome sauce. Now, Anthroposophist, is that from the work of Rudolf Steiner?
Oh, no, it's not. But I just came up with it.
Okay, well, have you seen anything in terms of Rudolf Steiner's work surrounding that?
No, tell me.
Well, he has this entire school and body of work on what he calls anthroposophy.
Oh, yes. Okay, cool.
Right.
Cool.
And so definitely check that out because it is pretty cool. And I was a Steiner person for a while. I had a moment of deeply diving into his work, and it's pretty interesting work today. I'm not really there, but when I initially saw your handle on Twitter as well as Instagram, I thought that you were connected with his work in some way.
No, but I guess I'll have to honor that. No, I mean, it was just, it kind of, to me, it sounded like one of these Hellenistic authors, like Thrasyllus, or, you know, it kind of ring to it. So I liked that. And anthro is just an acknowledgement of the anthropological sort of background that I have in thinking about society and social groups.
Awesome, Drew. Yeah. Drew, this has truly been an amazing conversation today, and I'm super grateful to have been able to have sat here with you and to just have had heard your depth of wisdom and just the depth of your thinking, because I think that you're thinking the right thoughts and you're thinking in the right direction in terms of really revisioning the astrology that we all participate in. So thank you so much for just sharing that with us here today.
Thank you, Mychal. This has been like so fun. Yeah, and you know, it's exciting to be engaging with you on the regular with all of these philosophical questions. And yeah, I'm so excited to continue to be in community with you and everybody out there.
Awesome sauce, Drew. And to our listeners and viewers out there, if this is your 100th time joining us here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, or if this is time number 1, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to share in this virtual astrological space with us. I receive your comments, your feedback, your encouragement, and your love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're creating here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, yes, go below and like this amazing video of this conversation between Drew and I, but also subscribe to the Oraculos True Divination podcast and also share this conversation that we had today with your other astrologically and magically minded friends, because more and more people need to know about these amazing conversations with these amazing astrologers from all around the world. So until next time, I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, wishing you love, leaving you in peace and in hope. Until we meet again, bye-bye for now. Drew Levanti.
I'm happy.
I'm happy.
That was so fun, yeah.